Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today we are joined by Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst for 27 years, who chaired the National Intelligence Estimates and also prepared the daily briefs for President Reagan, in addition to advising Henry Kissinger, if I'm not mistaken. I thought, yeah, you're a great person to speak with to make some sense of the chaos of the world. Again, we see now, yeah, Europe at war, obviously. It feels as if we also thrown away all principles with the being complicit and yeah, even backing the genocide in Gaza. We seem also to be at the brink of a major war if yeah, Israel, supported by the US, attacks Iran. And if you get through all of this, there might be also another conflict down the road if the economic war between the US and China escalates into the military sphere. So it's not a great time. So yeah, I was hoping if you could maybe shed some light on this and how these strategic challenges, what they look like. Again, if we take a step back for this broader perspective, do you see a wider shift in world order, or how do you make sense of yeah, the chaos being unleashed upon the world?
Well, Glenn, as you know, back in Soviet times, there was a favorite phrase, the correlation of world forces. Okay. Well, that meant something because what the Soviets tried to do was to make sure that China didn't steal a march in good relationships with the US and all kinds of other things. Correlation of forces, it's, international relations 101. You make sure that you have the force to meet any other force. Now, that's turned upside down. And I had the good fortune of being responsible for watching Russian relations, Soviet relations in those days with China, starting in 1964, when they were at loggerheads, when they were shooting across borders at each other, when China was claiming, with some due reason, 1.5 thousand kilometers of Siberia. Okay, so there was an irredenta there. Well, what happened? Well, after Vietnam, when this Sino-Soviet conflict came into bas relief, I might say, most people don't know that the Chinese and the Russians were in competition for leadership in the world communist movement. The Chinese were making great strides in having other communist parties listen to them rather than to Russia. And it became so acute during Vietnam when the arch imperialists, so called, well, the arch imperialists of the United States was trying to make war in Vietnam. Well, each socialist power felt it necessary to show its socialist credentials, and aid Vietnam. Did they need a lot of aid? No, not too much. But China gave them what they needed, and when the Russians tried to send rail or even airlift supplies to North Vietnam, the Chinese blocked it. Can you imagine? So that's how much they were at loggerheads. They forfeited any possibility for the productivity that would come from a decent relationship. And Kissinger and Nixon, and I was around then, okay, saw that. And they said, "Is this real?" And we had to defeat the troglodytes at the CIA, like James Jesus Angleton, who said, no, they're both commies, both commies. You're being deceived. You're being deceived by these commies." So, no, we told Kissinger, "No, this is real." Okay. Next thing you know, Kissinger goes to Beijing. And then Nixon goes to Beijing. Long story short, that was in January of 1972. The strategic arms limitation talks had come to pretty much a head. And Kissinger and Nixon said to us, "Do you think the Russians are serious?" And we said, "Yes, on two counts. One, they don't want to get in a spending match with the US for weaponry. Number two, they're afraid that your opening to China will allow China to develop a really good relationship with the US, and they don't want that to happen. So we see flexibility, like, for instance, a quadripartite agreement on Berlin, first time ever, happened during this period. So we were pretty confident. Yeah, if you meet their terms, if you negotiate what turned out to be the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the cornerstone for strategic stability for 3 decades, okay, from 1972 to 2002, when young Bush decided he didn't need that anymore. John Bolton told him, man, get out of it. So he did. So what happened? Well, I was in Moscow in 1972 because my branch had two people with the delegations, were they in Vienna or Helsinki, and one person writing up for the officials in Washington what was going on in the talks. So Jack Matlock and others with whom I was really working very closely, he was head of the Soviet desk at State. They said, you ought to go, you know, to get over there and be there part of me. This is a real, and I did. And I traveled around for 3 months after that. But it was the halcyon period because I'm one of those kids that used to hide under the desk, right? Afraid from the Russian atom bomb, okay? And here it was. We made it unnecessary, or we made it impossible for either side to think that they could launch a preemptive strike without being demolished in the process. So 3 decades of stability. Now, what I'm doing now is sort of think about, whoa, when I went to Moscow in 72, I had hopes that there would be détente, that there would be rapprochement, that Moscow and Washington would see their mutual interest being fostered by a decent relationship. And it went up and down, but finally, when Gorbachev came in, again, James Jesus Angleton and those folks said, he's just a clever commie, you know. Well, we knew better. That is, some of us. I was briefing Secretary Shultz, Secretary Weinberger, the national security advisors, and when Ronald Reagan woke up early in the morning, and early enough, then I would brief him too, but most of his advisors, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I was telling him, yeah, this Gorbachev is the real deal. Let's see what you can do. Long story short, 1987, the Intermediate Range Forces Treaty was signed, and that was unprecedented because, well, Gorbachev said to Reagan, look, we don't need these SS-20s, intermediate range ballistic missiles, and you don't need those Pershing 2s. Right now, if we got rid of them, we'd have the usual 30, 35 minutes of forewarning if there was something untoward happening. So let's get rid of them. Now, Reagan came to us and he said, my God, could we verify this? Doverai, no proverai, okay? Trust but verify. And we said, yes, we can. And as you know, my colleague Scott Ritter led the first team to to monitor for 2 years the hacking to pieces now some of these major ICBMs that the Russians had, and well, in this case, middle range, intermediate missiles. So that's the context out of which I come. So then we have Biden coming in, and despite Obama saying, people forget that Biden was vice president. Did he ever talk to Obama? Obama was realistic. What he said was, look, we have to be careful about what we adopt as our existential interests. Ukraine is not one of those. For Russia, it is, okay? And so the worst thing, I'm quoting Obama, the worst thing we could do would be to give Ukraine the notion that they could win a battle against a much superior Russia. So no offensive arms. Got that? No offensive arms. That made great sense. But first, Trump came in, started the offensive arms, then Biden went crazy with that. So what do we have now? We have a new Trump. And the new Trump says, I want to create a decent relationship with Russia. And the first thing I want to do is get rid of Ukraine. I want to get peace in Ukraine. And Putin and his advisors say, oh my God, do you think he's serious? Well, let's test him. What has happened, of course, is mutual agreement to meet in Istanbul. They've already done so once. They're going to do on this. They're going to do it again on the 2nd of June if Ukraine, as they expect, they will have to agree to meet the Russian delegation, which has prepared, as required during the first negotiation, a paper, a paper on its terms for resolution of this dispute. Just to bring that up to date, Nebensia talked. He's the Russian ambassador to the UN. He talked at 10 o'clock, so just an hour or two ago, and he gave a really interesting rendition of what's going to happen. Bottom line was no more Minsk Accords. Now, what was Minsk? Well, Minsk was a unanimously approved by the Security Council agreement, which included a ceasefire, but the Ukrainians never abided by it. It also included provisions where regional pro-Russian or Russian-speaking regions within Ukraine would have a measure of autonomy. That never happened. And worse than that, Glenn, and I'll finish this now, worse than that then was Merkel of Germany, Hollande of France, in charge of those countries at the time. Both said, Merkel, this is a quote, uh, we just viewed that as a delaying tactic because the Ukrainian army wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth very much when we changed the government there in Kiev. She didn't say when we changed it, but when the new government came in Kiev, okay? And we needed time to build up the Ukraine. Look at them now. Look at them now. So yeah, we diddled the Russians for 7 years. That's what we did. And she says that publicly, and so does Hollande. So today, Nebenzia says a lot of things, but the most important thing he said with most emphasis was, well, what was it here? I took some notes. Exactly what he said was, I can't read my own handwriting. What he said was, no more Minsk Accords. That's over. So what's going to happen is that, in my view, um, whatever happens on Monday, if the Ukrainians continue to be completely obstinate and show or even have no memorandum to share with the Russians, then the fly is going to be in the ointment because uh, Trump is going to have to decide, well, what does he do now? And what he'll do will be in cooperation with the Russians. This is unprecedented in recent decades, not unprecedented in mine. They're talking to each other. That's what Lavrov emphasizes. Look, in the old days, well, not the old days, during Biden, we didn't talk to each other. I couldn't get Tony Blinken to stop for a moment where he traveled all around the world and talk to me, okay? So now they're talking to each other, and Lavrov says, look, if these things come up, we have a way of talking Turkey. I mean, we have a way of talking real issues, and we don't have to respond to every leak to the press about how dangerous or how stupid or how crazy our president Putin is. Sorry to take so long, but I think we need the backdrop to what's going on here to understand this is a bigger game. Russia and the US want to create a decent relationship. Ukraine is the focus right now, but it's within that context, and the US and Russia are together in trying to work out some sort of arrangement, short of complete defeat for the Ukrainians. Medvedev, the former president, said this week, well, you talk about, what will happen. Well, it could be World War III if, when we advance and take over almost all of Ukraine, And people say, well, what will happen? Will be World War III if you keep supplying weapons? Uh, I'll end here. It's important to note Putin doesn't want to do that, okay? He doesn't want to occupy almost all of Ukraine. He wants a deal. He sees a deal maker. He sees a deal maker who Putin, says, after all these betrayals, Minsk and the rest of them, after all those betrayals, Putin has the, well, courage to say, this guy is for real. I'm going to deal with him. He can be trusted. Whoa, there hasn't been any trust between the US and Russia for a very long time. So uh, now on the other side, with respect to Trump, he's really in trouble with all those neocons that he was forced to put on his team. But he's dismissing those hand over foot there at the NSC and other places. So I think if Trump is given proceeds and just says, look, they're not going to do it to me this time like they did last time. I'm going to work out a decent relationship with Russia. He will succeed in that. It's going to take more months and more facing into this terrible opposition that he has from Kellogg and from some of his own team, for God's sake, who have completely unrealistic expectations and even facts with respect to the failing Russian economy and how the sanctions are working and how millions of Russian soldiers are being killed. Where do they get that stuff? I don't know.
I think you're spot on with this no more Minsk Accords picking up on this because that's keeps being the impression I also get out of Moscow, which is but also what it represents, which is they want an actual end to this war because what Minsk represented was a temporary ceasefire to change realities on the ground and restart the war on the more favorable terms for NATO. So again, I think this is why the Russians are so fiercely opposed to the ceasefire because, well, we're not even pretending that it's, it's not supposed to be a political settlement to resolve it. It's just freeze it. We will use that time, we say, to ramp up industrial production, pump more weapons in, stabilize the front lines. And from the Russian perspective, what happens if the fighting stops? I mean, in Europe, they have these slogans now that, oh, if Putin really wanted peace, he would stop fighting. But as soon as the fighting stops, what possible reason in the world would the Europeans and Zelensky have to make any concessions in terms of, neutrality and the territorial changes? So it's again, it should be common sense, but the need for an actual political settlement that puts an end to this, it's really what they demand after all these years and all the destruction. Um, However, I wanted to know though, what is it? What else is at stake here? Because you also mentioned that the Russians and the Americans have interests beyond this. Indeed, they would like to overcome Ukraine and the wider European conflict now in order to shift priorities. So, well, again, on the topic of the direction of the world, how did we end up with with the effort to deprioritize Ukraine and what kind of a larger what is at stake here? What does the Americans want with Russia?
Well, the backdrop of this, of course, is that there used to be a triangular relationship, Russia, the US, and China. It was sort of equilateral in my time. As I pointed out before, Kissinger and Nixon took advantage of Soviet in those days worries about China stealing a march in relations with the US. Well, even people like Kissinger uh, wrote and said later, look, it looks like the Chinese and the Russians are sort of getting together, and that would be the worst. That would be terrible. Brzezinski said the same. Even these hardliners say, for God's sake, don't drive them together. And that's exactly what Obama, Trump, Biden, not the current Trump. He's not guilty of this, but the others are. And now we have, instead of let's say, a equilateral triangle, we have an isosceles one, if you remember your geometry, with the big arms, Russia and China, and uh, the U.S. on the short end of the stick or the triangle, if you will. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. It's two against one now. And that's the strategic equation. It's just that Russia and China are sort of garnering the rest of the global south and people in BRICS. The shift has already occurred. I wouldn't say it's a multipolar world yet. Still a bipolar world. It's the U.S. and its pretensions to be indispensable or even well, indispensable. And the rest of the world say, well, okay, you were. We could see that you were arch colonialists like those other guys there in Western Europe, but you're not indispensable anymore. We've got the people, we've got the GNP now, we've got everything. Uh, so take notice of that. Now, Trump's people, I don't know, what do you got? It's just sort of Trump is pretty his own man, right? And he's got Witkoff, and they say, well, we can deal on this. And the other element, Glenn, that I would add is that we know there was an assassination attempt on Putin on the 20th of May, if memory serves. Um, it was a swarm of these unmanned vehicles and so forth. And the commander of the Air Force in that area, he was flying in his helicopter to Kursk, said, we were able to shoot most of them down, but it was, he was in it. He was in the helicopter. And that's how close they came. So there's that. Now, as we know, there were two assassination attempts on Trump before he even became elected. So what I'm saying here is these are human beings, right? These are people, each of which knows that he or his opposite number might not be long for this world, literally, okay? I think on Putin's part, he sees a historic dimension to this, and he sees an opposite number in America. However, what's the word? However uh, crazy in his terms, however unfocused or unpredictable, I guess is the word that the Russians used way back when, and saying, well, they preferred Biden because he was predictable. That was a big joke, of course. But anyhow, what they see is this guy not only apparently wanting to do a deal here, but despite all the unpredictability and all the all the rhetoric, all this stupid stuff he says, he's our best last chance. He's our best white hope, so to speak, okay? And so he might not be long for this world either. So let's see if we can do a deal. The West Europeans or the Europeans, they're no help at all, but they don't really matter. And we're persuaded, Putin would say, we're persuaded, Trump, that they really don't matter, so diss them. When they come up, as they did about 3 weeks ago, here's our plan. And there was indications that Kellogg and maybe even Rubio were behind us. We're in on this plan. Here's the plan: immediate ceasefire for 30 days, right? Immediate, okay, or else. And the else is bone-crushing sanctions, right? And by Monday, you got to do it by Monday, okay? Now they said that on Friday. I was in Moscow at the time. I was flying home when a lot of the media representatives that came to see the victory celebrations in Moscow are still around. So next thing I know, Putin said, hey, gather all the media people. I want to have a press conference. Yeah, Mr. President, it's at 2 o'clock in the morning. Bring them here. So Putin says, look, I'm going to send a delegation to Istanbul Thursday, okay? Put that in your pipe and smoke it, okay? There's going to be a good delegation. we really want to do this through negotiations. The next day, what does President Trump do? Well, he's got a choice. He can either support Kellogg, Rubio, and the Europeans, or he can support Putin. What does he do? He says, I think Mr. Putin is an excellent suggestion. I do hope that Zelensky and everybody else will go there to Istanbul on Thursday. Okay. Whoa. So that's the way the game has been played. It's been two, in this case, Putin and Trump against the Europeans and against some of the naysayers in Russia. You probably have a better feel for the naysayers in Russia, but if I were asked were there any, I'd say yes, there are. And what are they saying nay to? They're saying nay to no. They're saying nay to NATO, of course, but they're also saying nay to going so slowly, for God's sake. Why don't you just finish the damn thing off, which the Russians can do? And interestingly enough, Putin himself referred to that in a major speech. He said, there are lots of people in my administration that say, why don't you go faster? They'd like us to go much faster, but we're doing just fine here. And in reality, they are. But I would stress just one more time the time element here. I think both presidents, Trump and Putin, feel that they personally or their opposite number may not belong for this world, that for the first time in decades, you have presidents who are willing to deal, okay, and that Ukraine is eminently dealable once they rein in the Ukrainians and either rein them in or show them to be irretrievably dumb. And then, of course, Trump has the option of saying, well, look, I gave it my best effort. I tried with Putin and it didn't work out. So, okay, Europeans, you're going to help out. You're going to help Ukraine. We're out of here. Good luck. Okay, good luck. That's possible. It all depends on what happens on Monday and in the ensuing days and weeks. And I say, this is a really salutary element, this time element, because otherwise, Putin is in no hurry at all. Okay, no hurry. They're moving very deliberately but effectively along that whole 800 kilometer, 800 kilometer. No, what is it? The line there between the battle line. They're moving very well. The only time urgency I think he feels is that if you get these people in Germany like Merz ruling the Rus there in Europe, and something happens to Trump, or he's overcome by these troglodytes, well, then this window of opportunity will have shut down, and we'll have to turn to the east once again and give up any hope of trying to work out a workable relationship with the United States as well as the rest of Europe.
Yet, if let's say Trump can pull off a deal acceptable to Russia, given that they're so far away though from not just Europe and Zelensky, but also the United States, besides Trump. I mean, would Trump be able to sell such a piece to his own political class? Because earlier on you mentioned this, during the Cold War, the assumption that the Russians were no good commies. You couldn't trust anything they did, and this is a key weakness in human nature. That is, the world is complex. We have to make a lot of assessment analysis, so we develop, these heuristics, these mental shortcuts to interpret things, and often this entails dumbing down and simplifying. So yeah, everything becomes about communism and capitalism, which is by the way was also a key misread of the whole Vietnam War. But we do the same thing now. If I listen to the own political class around Europe, they only communicate in this language of, oh, they're authoritarian, imperial. We are, freedom-loving democracy. So it makes it very difficult to accept anything that comes from Russia. And I spoke with the great Jack Matlock the other day, well, a few weeks ago, and he had this. I found this one thing fascinating. He was saying how when him and Reagan decided, they had to start to talk with the Soviets, try to negotiate, see if it was possible to find a peace to end the Cold War. That the first thing they had to do is first fight a very fierce opposition from from their own ranks, from the American political class, because again, they had bought in completely to this idea that, well, the Russians don't want peace, they're just looking for a soft spot they can take advantage of before they advance further. And this kind of was the rhetoric which everyone had to accept and internalize if they wanted to have some political legitimacy in Washington. I mean, you can't walk around Washington saying that, the Russians are reasonable like us, like Kennedy suggested, he ended up dead. So, you can't say these things. And so they all end up embracing these same slogans and, yeah, this irrational framing of everything as being this, struggle of good versus evil. So, yeah, I guess a long-winded question, but my question boils down to: is it actually possible, though, for the political class in America to accept this? Because I know for a fact the Europeans will not. But it doesn't really matter, as you said before. I think if the United States decides on something, the Russians agree, and they can pressure Zelensky. And again, the Americans are financing this war, so they can't pull the plug. So all of this is possible. Then they can ignore the Europeans. So, but the real question is, well, what Trump, I think, can do within his own camp. So, do you see him having to go the same path as Matlock and Reagan, battling his own people first?
Yes, it's incredible to reflect on this, but it's just as bad as it was during McCarthy. Now, I was alive for Senator McCarthy's performance. I was a teenager, but I used to hear very, very loud disputes in my home, in my living room, as my father waged battle with several of his colleagues about whether McCarthy was right or was he wrong. And the thing was stacked for McCarthy. In my little milieu, Cardinal Spellman says he's right. Whoa, this kind of stuff, this blind obedience to the authorities that don't know much about the situation. So McCarthyism is really strong. Russophobia is really strong. I had an interesting vignette that I could share. I was over in Moscow with Oliver Stone, and that got me to meet some very, very, very top officials. Okay. Now, this wasn't the president, but it was someone very close to him. And he turns to me over this dinner that he invited us to, and he says, Mr. McGovern, you're a Russian area specialist. You know language, you taught the language. How come you don't hate Russians? And I said, oh, and I thought, well, I guess in my day, the late 50s and early 60s, when I was studying Russian and Russian culture and Russian liturgy and Russian music and Russian history and Russian social, they didn't teach me to hate Russians. They were all, some of them were emigres, some of them were refugees, but they all loved the Russian language. They all loved the old Russia, you know. They were very careful, you know. We had a simplified Russian grammar. It was the only thing they could teach from. And then one of the chapters has the kolhozniks, okay, the collective farm workers, okay, washing their cars on Saturday. This drove my teachers up to washing their cars. These were the most deprived, the peasants that had nothing, and they were washing. So they were alert to all the propaganda, but they taught us about Russia. And it was not like Harvard and Yale, where they had Richard Pipes and Zbigniew Brzezinski, Poles that drank Russophobia from their mother's milk, And so I was the beneficiary. I tried to explain that in just a couple of sentences to this fellow. And he said, oh, so So you don't hate Russia? I said, no, I understand Russia. And you know, I don't know if I have it here, but there was a button in Germany when I was there about 6 years ago. Putin Versteher, okay? There's a picture of Putin and it says Putin Versteher. Now, Verstehen in German, you might know, means to understand, okay? So a Putin Versteher is somebody who understands Putin. So I said, wow, to my friend, oh, well, give me one of those. I'm gonna, no, don't wear that. What do you mean? This is a pejorative. This is awful. This is meaning you're in Putin's pocket. Putin versteht. But understand? Yeah, understand is also verboten. Okay, well, that's how bad it is. Now,
It's the
these
worst
days,
slur there is, isn't it? To understand your opponent.
yeah, I
It
mean,
really, boggles the mind. I
yeah,
remember when I used to teach security studies and strategy, both in Australia and then later in Russia. I always made a point, don't hate your opponents. Once you bring in the hate, then it's going to be very, very poor analysis that you come up
exactly.
with when the answer to every question is, yeah, the conflict exists because the other guy is just very, very evil. I mean, it's yeah, it's very dangerous, but yeah, it's very common to fall into that trap, though.
It
Sorry for
is,
interrupting.
and that's the major reality here. The media, the, what I call the Mickey Matt, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Mickey Matt sort of rhymes a little bit with Mickey Mouse, so you can remember it, okay? It's what the MIC, the military industrial complex, has evolved to since Eisenhower warned about it. And what Eisenhower said at that time was the only antidote, the only way we can defeat the expansion of the power of the MIC, military industrial complex, is to have a well informed populace, a well informed citizenry. And we don't have that anymore. And that is really, it manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Ray, you're going to Russia? My God. Uh, the what are you doing that for? And here's a little thing. Angela Merkel, that I mentioned before, guilty of diddling the Russians on the Minsk Accords. Well, she had to defend herself a month ago. They said, you're a Putin Versteher. And she said, well, wait a second. I object to that. Verstehen is not a bad idea if you want to deal with your partner. So if I'm a Putin Versteher, well, I don't take that as an insult anymore. Angela Merkel. So the Germans, the Germans are even worse victims of a captive media than the United States, if you can believe it. I know something about Germany. I lived there for 5 years, okay? They are in bad shape, and there are very few rays of light, but there is one party run by Sarah Wagenknecht, called the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, that thinks it achieved 5% of the vote in the last election, and that it was frittered away uh, by others that didn't want them to get a share in the government. They have a court case going now. It's completely possible that they will win their 5% share, and then the government will have to deal with that in some kind of way. Anyhow, the reason I mention that is that there's one really, really serious, courageous woman in Sarah Wagenknecht's orbit. Her name is Sevim Dagledin, and she put it in these terms. The media in Germany is so bad. She said, look, unsere, unsere erste Pflicht ist, sich von diesem Königreich von Lügen nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, so it is our first duty, Pflicht, von diesem Königreich, from this kingdom of Lügen, of lies, okay? It's our first duty from this kingdom of lies not to let ourselves be made dumm, nicht dumm machen zu lassen, okay? Well, there's a certain resonance in that now. And there's lots of ferment in Germany. I cite Sevim Dagleden because she gives me great hope that there is a latent um, German psyche that can look at information and assimilate it in a way that realizes that what this fellow Merz is doing is not only dangerous, but really dumb.
We have a German version of that in this country, well, I mean, in Norway. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, our former foreign minister and defense minister, she said, "This is not the time to understand; it's the time to condemn." Just, you know, also, no understanding here, So
Yeah.
it's yeah, and it ends up in the same thing that if you understand, then it's like, well, if you're trying to understand their point of view, again, which should be the point of departure in any mitigation of the security
Yeah.
competition, seems common sense. But this is problematic because, once you understand, you're kind of legitimizing. This is the idea. But of course, there's some grain to truth if you explain, even if there's a crime committed, if you explain why it happened to learn from it, you can be seen as legitimizing it. But, if you
Yeah.
take this line, then what do you do then? Do you just lean into the ideological condemnation? We're good, they're bad. Celebrate
Well,
their
it
own
really
virtue
helps.
and hate their, belligerence. It's very, yeah, indeed. I actually had a debate with her last week, and because I was arguing that NATO we helped to provoke this war, and she said, "Well,
Yeah.
you're a useful idiot for Putin. How dare you say such a thing?" So this
Well,
is the level of discourse here. I mean,
yeah,
people.
yeah.
They're not
Well,
allowed to discuss the security concerns of their opponents. It's just, but if you so it almost celebrates stupidity and the virtue of just condemning the other guy.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like the
Stol
Palestinians. Do you condemn 7th of October? Do you condemn the Russians? Do you
yeah,
take do you belong to the Communist Party? This is it's very much McCarthy all over again from my perspective.
yeah. Let me just say, where is Jens Stoltenberg from?
He's he's Norwegian. He's
Yeah.
yeah, actually,
Okay.
yeah,
So
he's
it's a,
yeah, he's not
now, no offense to you, but you have some real cool characters there that don't want to understand the Russians. And, I just mentioned Stoltenberg because it bears repeating that Stoltenberg was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, let's say.
hmm.
So he's speaking to the EU Parliament about a year and almost 2 years ago, and he says, "Look, Putin didn't want any enlargement of NATO. And he said, if you keep trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade." And so we said, no. And so he invaded. And we got enlargement anyway with Finland and with Sweden. Ha ha ha! Oh my God! 1 million people dead in Ukraine when there was an
Thousand,
agreement
yeah.
in April of 2022. And this guy, no offense, no, I have some of my best friends are Norwegian,
Oh, no
including
offense
you.
taken. He's not our finest, not one of our
So,
finest.
but there you go. And if you look at history and this business about Ukraine and NATO, you mentioned Jack Matlock. Um, he's a very good friend of mine. We struggled together to persuade Nixon and Kissinger that it was possible to deal with the Russians, the more so since they were afraid of the Chinese. And he was instrumental in getting me to Moscow for that signing of the treaty. Uh, when Bill Clinton, who is the first violator of this agreement not to move NATO 1 inch to the east, when he was proposing to do this, there were hearings. In those days, we had hearings, okay? And they did invite Jack Matlock. And he said, this is crazy. George Kennan's just said it's crazy. Kissinger said, everybody who knows about this says this is crazy. It's going to lead to war with Russia, or at least the dismemberment of Ukraine. Now, Jack told me that he made well, he did. I saw it. He made an eloquent presentation, and then after it was over, the staffers from this committee came up to him and says, "Ambassador Matlock, we agree with you completely, but this is a political thing. Clinton wants to get those votes in the Midwest. He's afraid that Dole might do. So he's appearing to the East European. So forget about it. You're right, but you're not going to change his mind. That's the way it works. Now, Putin himself has acknowledged that U.S. foreign policy is a creature of domestic politics within the U.S. So he knows all this. And yet he's trying to do this one last chance with Trump to see if they can escape having to occupy, as Medvedev threatens, almost all of Ukraine. The other thing that I would stress here has to do with, well, the Russians will never stop. You know that, Clint. You've heard that several times. Biden, you think the Russians will stop at Ukraine? No, they're going to go to Poland. They're going to go up to Baltic states. No, they're not going to stop. Come on. Well, the Russians already stopped. And Americans don't know that. The Russians stopped in March, April 2022, 6 weeks after the war began, in return for a cessation of trying to get Ukraine in NATO. They proposed a ceasefire. They proposed not to take any Ukrainian land. It was a deal. It was signed. It was signed by Medinsky, the guy who's resuming those negotiations now, and against whom the Ukrainian secret services are proposing to do bad things to his wife or his children. God. Anyhow, so it was initial. Do we have the text of that? We have almost the whole text. Yeah, it was a real deal. Even what's her name, Fiona Hill, even she acknowledges that this was the deal. What happened? The Russians stopped. They stopped before Kiev. They withdrew some troops as a token of goodwill, and then Boris Johnson came in. Now, you don't have to believe me. The negotiators for Ukraine told that openly to the Ukrainian media. Yeah, we had the whole deal, and all of a sudden Boris Johnson came in on behalf of the U.S. and so on. Said, no, fight on, okay? So what I'm saying in my roundabout way is the Russians already stopped, all right? They didn't want all of Ukraine. They were even able to stop before they got the Donbass or anything else. That was the deal. Now the deal is going to be very different because they were forced to keep going, okay? Now, Poland, is there any sensible analyst of foreign affairs that says the Russians have their eyes on Poland? Well, if you take off sensible, yeah, there are a whole bunch of people like Timothy Snyder, professor at Yale. Hey, the Russians will go to the English Channel before you get well, it's all drivel. It's all bollocks, as the Russian, the British would say. And yet, here's the fly in the ointment. I dare say, if you took a poll of Americans today, most would say, yeah, we've got to stop Putin in Ukraine because next thing you know, he'll be in Poland, next thing, the Baltic states. They believe this stuff. So there's a degree of naivete here. And last thing here is that when a previous president, and you mentioned him as well, Glenn, John F. Kennedy, when he pointed out that, look, Russian children breathe the same air we do, Russian parents want the same things for their children. We were 8 months ago close to obliterating not only both countries, but the rest of the world. Let's see if we can do something. Now, he did something. He sent Harriman to Geneva with instructions, conclude a limited test ban treaty, for God's sake. And Harriman said, "Oh, Congress will never buy that. My God, I hate that. Do it." He did it. Did Congress approve it? Well, Kennedy was a good politician, okay? He got approval for that treaty, okay? So now, disregarding what happened to Kennedy, it's not a done deal that Trump, if he worked out a reasonable uh, agreement with Ukraine and Russia, it's not inconceivable that the Lindsey Grahams would eat crow and approve it. So it happened before. It happened a long time ago. That was 1963, for God's sake. I'm dating myself, but I was there. I was working at the CIA at the time, and I saw great hope there. The more so since Kennedy had issued two executive orders, one to withdraw 1,000 troops from Vietnam by the end of that year, 1963, and then uh, the the majority of the rest of them by 2000, 1965. Of course, he was killed in November of 1963. Uh, you know, uh, Trump was almost killed twice recently. Not so recently, but when he was campaigning. Uh, yeah, I think he's a little bit fearless on this thing and willing to take the risks. Uh, but as I said before, Putin as well as Trump know that each might be living on borrowed time. And that's a strange sort of catalyst to action. But hey, whatever you have, use it.
I just feel I feel the biggest strength of Trump though is his same as his weakness. That is his ability to say whatever he wants because he tends to. It seems like now he's yeah well threatening almost yeah the Russians. I think so far they've just been looking the other way that this is just how he talks, but it is. But again, it's I think it's also strength because I think a lot of the problems we have now with being able to yeah resolve the problems with Russia is that everyone kind of has to repeat the same mantra. I mean, I've seen this news reports from Business Insider, CNN that Putin bathes in the blood of theirs. I mean, and it's just well, my point is there's nothing you can say about Putin which anyone wants to oppose because who wants to come to the defense of Putin? And if they say tomorrow, Putin eats children, who's going to say no? Nobody wants to be seen as defending. So we end up in this, I think, mass psychosis where everyone is just repeating things we know really deep inside isn't true, but is still by creating consensus around this madness, it's very difficult to talk to opponents. I guess my big hope for Trump was that his ability to defy all these narratives and just say, no, no, that sounds like nonsense. I can say that, yeah, would NATO provoke the war? Like, he can get away with anything. I think that is sadly the medicine we need at the moment.
Well, Glenn, on that count, about 3 months ago, Trump did say, I can understand why the Russians don't want Ukraine and NATO. I mean, I can understand that. I mean, right up against their border there, yeah, yeah. And so he has sort of tried to voice his conception of all this. Now the media will, of course, jump all over that, and that's really the major problem. Myself and my fellow veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, you can't get much media share. No one can. And I would just say that when I said the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank, Mickey Matt, the reason I said media as if in all capital letters is simply because the media is the cornerstone. Who owns the media? Oh, the rest of the Mickey Man. So is the media going to do anything that would lessen the need for more and more arms and more sophisticated arms and $1 trillion Pentagon budget? No, they're not. The news organizations are like a 1/10 of the profits of these major mega corporations that run the media. So there are alternative media now, and we're making some gains. You have a whole bunch of followers, Glenn. I'm really glad to see that. And before we close here, I just want to ask you, you've been in Russia many times. You know a lot about Russia. And actually, if memory serves, you either had dinner with Mr. Putin, or at least you were in a small circle with him. If it's possible for me to interview you now, what did you think? Bearing in mind that you might get in trouble with your Norwegian uh, Russia haters.
Sorry, I missed the question. If
Oh,
you,
the question is, when you were you in the same room with Mr. Putin,
yeah,
what impressions did you get? And I wanted to give you an out, not
oh yeah.
answering that because I don't want you to be hung, drawn, and quartered by your Norwegian colleagues. So you don't have to
Well,
answer.
well, no, well, I think it's a good question because it is a question one can't answer. Because when you ask the question here, you can only see something bad, but it's kind of that irony is that even a lot of American leaders have said very positive things about him. Clinton once said, when he said something, he would do it. He didn't lie. So, that made it possible for to have trust and cooperation.
Mhm.
You had Bush say similar positive things. So it's just that after the war began now, after the Russians invaded, this is in human nature. Nobody wants to hear reality. They just want to hear that you pick the right side. Are you with us, the in group, or the Russians, the out group? So they just want to hear your loyalty, and your loyalty is expressed through the narrative which you repeat. So if so you have to, well, he's evil, bad. You just have to repeat all these things, but it's not the case. He's not stupid either. He's very, analytical. He's very polite to the audience as well. He's very well informed. He sits there for hours speaking, and no, no, he's again. I think one of the reasons we hate him in the West is the same reason the Russians love him, or why he's the most popular leader in Europe among his own population. He took the country when it was on its knees, and it was common to expect that the country would collapse. The economy had collapsed. The society was falling apart with just deaths going through the roof. NATO could bomb their Serbs, their closest allies almost, and they could do nothing. So they were humiliated. Everything was falling apart. Everyone more or less expected they would go the way of the Soviet Union. And it comes in place even within the first term. He reduced poverty, those people under the poverty line, in half. It's kind of incredible. And so but if you can't accept the things he's done right, how can you possibly understand what the attraction is for him in Russia? So I get the pressure here that you only can say bad things, but it's like saying that Putin's a dictator. Once you say it, then you delude yourself into thinking he doesn't need the approval of the rest of the political class. So I don't want to. I rather take the punishment I get in the media and from the academic community here by instead saying what I actually believe. And I think he's very clever. He's he often, well, he tends to do as he say. And no, again, one say I don't think it's healthy to look in terms of being for or against, because I don't want to have to be in a position to support everything someone does. But I think that he's done a lot of great things for Russia, and I think that this means that it's very negative for us to some extent, because after the Cold War we did build a Europe where everyone was supposed to be a part of it except for Russia. We tried to create a Europe where the only country who shouldn't be a part is the largest country in Europe. There was no way this wouldn't result in a crisis. The whole premise, as people like William Perry and others argued in the 90s, was, well, we didn't listen to the Russians because they were weak. Everyone realized that this would result in tensions with the Russians, but who cares if they're just going weaker? our relations with the Russian entails managing their decline. So the mere strengthening of Russia, the recovery of Russia, has become a problem in its own. So, so no, it doesn't mean I would support everything he does. I do think that, there's too much power concentrated perhaps in the presidency. There's a lot of things one can comment on, but overall, I think he's been a good leader, which is why the Russians do support him in a huge way. Indeed, if you ask the Russians, one of the key weaknesses is that too much stability has been placed on the long presidency of Putin. What happens after he's gone? Again, so it is a huge it is a huge issue, and I wish it was possible to discuss the Putin presidency in more nuanced terms. But again, as I always told my students, don't hate your opponents. It's very hard not to for people to follow this, and they also expect you to follow in that you have to hate them, and if you hate them, you can't say anything positive. But
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it's going down in history as one of the great leaders of Russia. Again,
I believe so.
just just as a disco, yeah, just doesn't mean I support everything, but it is important to recognize the strength of the other side of the opponent and not underestimate them, because this is the key thing. How can we think that we're going to crush the Russian economy by the end of the week? How could we think that we're going to defeat the Russian on the battlefield with a proxy Ukrainian army? How do you think we're going to isolate Russia in the world, make the Chinese, Indian all turn our back? This whole idea that there are gas station masquerading as a country, we end up deluding ourselves. We have to be very honest about who we're dealing with. And, Russia is a very powerful country. They're very, they reflect a lot on on what they do. So no, no, I know it's lands me in trouble, but I do think if you set up clear metrics, what a good leader should look like, how strong, I think he's done a lot of good work for Russia. And
Yeah, and yeah, I would simply add, picking up from your point about when he took over, Russia was a shambles, uh, and it was largely our fault. Yeltsin was propped up by the Wall Street guys and the Harvard boys who came in and, with Russian and other oligarchs, plundered the Russian economy. It's on the record. When Yeltsin was going to lose in, what was it, 1996, it's an open secret that all kinds of IMF and other money was pumped in there, and apparently he won. Okay. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that here's a metric for you. In 1991, if memory serves now, these are World Bank statistics, right? 1991, the average age at which a Russian male died was 83. In 1995, it was 76. My God, there were people dying on the street. No more. Okay. So that's just one thing that most Russians, certainly Russians of my age and younger, uh, understand and give him his numbers now at 82%, the last
yeah,
poll that I saw, 82%, my God. The other thing I'd mention is simply that I had the good fortune to be with Oliver Stone, as I mentioned, and so you get special treatment. I'm sitting at the parade on May 9th there, right in front of the Russian Prime Minister and the head of the Russian Senate, and Medvedev was over there, and I could have turned around and talked to them, but I didn't. Now, what's my point here? We're watching Putin give a speech. And the previous week was full of NATO saying, don't go to Russia. Don't send anybody to Russia. We won the war, not the Russians. And our president said,
yeah,
look, we had the most powerful country in the world. We won, and so we won the war. We won the war hands down. Well, if I were Putin and I weren't so calm, cool, and collected like he undeniably is, I would have made some snide remarks about that, like how many Americans died during World War II? Oh, 440,000. How many Russians? 27 million. Uh, who killed two-thirds of the Germans? Russians did. Uh, was the war already won by the time the Allies landed in Normandy? Well, what does he say instead of being snide like that? He says, we want to mention how happy we are and grateful for the opening of the second front in Normandy. Now, there had been decisive battles on in the Russian uh, homeland, but this was a big help. And we welcome the spirit of comradeship that the Allies would have, and we rejoice together with them. Oh, I mean, I mean, in terms of what's the word, cordiality or grace, maybe grace. I mean, that's a pretty graceful thing to say, given all the abuse that everyone in the West had heaped on the Russians, pretending that the Russians were not really part of this. Let me do one little vignette more, and I'm sorry to keep this so long, but when I was in Russia to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe, the river in Germany, where finally on April 25th, 1945, I was 9 years old, but I read it in a history book, okay? They met at the Elbe, the Russian forces, the Soviet forces, and the US, okay? Well, we planted a little tree. We had a celebration in Moscow to mark that occasion, okay? And I was asked to speak, and I recited a Russian poem about Russian grief, and it went over pretty well. And all of a sudden, this very big 6'4" Soviet general in, in Soviet uniform comes up to me, and I said to myself, "Oh, what's going on now?" And he looks at me and he says, "Studebaker, Studebaker." Studebaker, and he rips this a big bear hug, this big guy. And much of this audience won't realize what that means. Studebaker was as big a car manufacturer as Ford or General Motors. They turned over their whole factory and plant to building trucks and all kinds of other vehicles to carry artillery, to carry troops. And these deuce and a halfs, the trucks, actually, I used them in the army as well. They could go up mountains, they could go through snow. So what General Adamov was his name, he's saying to me is, I don't know any English. I see that you sympathize with our losses, but I'm so grateful for Studebaker. So that was Lend-Lease. Did we help the Russians win the war? Of course we did. We sent about, I think the numbers are 150,000 Studebakers, Jeeps and deuce and a half, 2.5 ton trucks. That's the army jargon. Through Iran into the South Caucasus, and they got to where uh, then Lieutenant Abdamov was fighting with his troops and killing and throwing back the Nazi horde. So there's so much that can be drawn on in terms of support by Russia for the United States and vice versa. Actually, most people don't know that during the Civil War and even during the Revolution, Russia sent its navy around to deter British and French ships from helping the South in the Civil War and helping uh, helping the Patriots defend themselves against the British fleet, given the fact that the U.S. had no real fleet to speak of. But there's such a reservoir of goodwill here if people were able to know this history. And if they looked at the right places, I have a website, web, raymcgovern.com, and I published 5 years ago a colloquium between Larry Wilkerson and Scott Ritter arguing about how much of a role Lend-Lease, the provision of Studebakers and other weaponry, contributed to the win. There was very, very good colloquy. You could see it on my website. But these are very interesting, and these are questions that American school books don't really teach. There's a great, as I say, a reservoir from which to draw trust. And let's hope that some of this truth can get out to American audiences, and they can tell their friends, look, Putin has no horns. He's certainly not a second Hitler. If you're looking for a second Hitler, you might want to look in Berlin these days. He sounded very much like that old guy. And well, I'll leave it at that, Glenn. I hope I haven't lost you any audience.
No, oh well, only reason yeah, I don't like the question is not because it's not a good question. It's just there's consequences in this because there's only one answer you're allowed to. And again, if any of our awful journalists watch, there's going to be a headline in the paper tomorrow. Glenn thinks Putin is a great leader. He's pro-Putin. He's
Yeah.
effectively a traitor. That this is the direction to go. So I like it more when you can, establish, objective indicators or metrics for what a good leader would deliver. Then, then you can take an objective analysis. The problem is we
Yeah.
don't, we kind of criminalized it here, which makes it very difficult to speak openly. Just before I go, on the Lend-Lease though, and the trucks. Actually, I was in Iran a few weeks ago, and that same route the Americans shipped their weapons into the Soviet Union. This is along the same route now. They're developing this international north-south transportation corridor, which connects Iran and India with Russia. So there's some historical continuity here, except you know, also obviously some change with the continuity. So.
Mhm. Mhm.
Anyways, I think I've already taken a bit too much of your time, Ray. So
No, no.
thank you again. I
If they
appreciate
call
your
you
time.
a if they call you if they say you're in Putin's pocket,
Yeah.
please tell him that I'm in. I have a pocket. Putin has another pocket for me. Okay, and that it is criminally insane to be against understanding your opponent. And I just hope that we can get rid of this criminal insanity. Thanks very much, Glenn, for letting me talk as much as you did.
Well, thanks again. I hope to speak to you again soon. So thanks.
Thank, thank you.